Welcome to today's Congressional Candidate Conversation brought to you by Power the Future. Power the Future is a national nonprofit focused on being the voice of and the champions for energy workers across America. We appreciate the candidates taking time to talk energy, resource development, and jobs with us, as they are going to be more and more important here in the great land in the last frontier. These candidates want to be your representative and earn your vote on November 8th. So let's get to the conversation, shall we? As we discuss jobs, Alaska's bright energy future, and more, as we start the conversation here, brought to you by Power the Future. Welcome to this conversation as we talk with congressional candidates about jobs, resource development, and more. I am joined by our sitting Congresswoman, the Congresswoman for all Alaska, Mary Peltola. Mary, welcome. It's so awesome to see you.
Good to see you again, Rick. Always good to see you.
Yeah, this has been a whirlwind couple of weeks for you, and I appreciate you taking the time. One of my favorite topics in the world is representation in DC, and we could do that all day long and talk about that. But let's talk energy and resource development and the things that really drive Alaska. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. So the first question that I have for you, Congresswoman, is what should the U.S.'s goal be with an energy mix, right? We hear all the time about fossil fuels should go away. We should just transition to renewables only. Yet in Alaska, that makes it kind of tough. So what should be the goal, and what are you working for in Congress to achieve that?
Well, I think long term, obviously, we need to be working on renewables. And in the short term, obviously, we do have a dependence on oil and gas, but I think it's really important that we strengthen our resolve for an orderly transition to renewables wherever we can. And we need to acknowledge that, particularly for liquid fuels like avgas, aviation fuel, Jet A, we really need to overcome some of the technological and cost factors before we can talk about a full transition. Wind has really been a great source of energy across Alaska, and that was something that the Bush Caucus and I worked very hard on 14 years ago, and the 10 years before that. We invested a lot in wind, and I think we're, look at Kodiak, they're over 98%. 98% of their energy for electricity is derived from wind, which I think is just a great success story. But when we're talking about wind and solar and nuclear, I guess, and hydroelectric power, all of those should be contributors to the country's energy mix. And we have to acknowledge that power sources won't always be located where we need the energy. The country, we really have to work on finding ways to build new transmission lines that don't divide communities, literally or figuratively dividing communities. Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, that's what I think we need to be working on, is both the long term and just recognizing that we will have gaps in the short term that we're going to have to accommodate with oil and gas.
The Inflation Reduction Act gave America a big boost, $400 billion of money towards building out these transmission lines, renewable energy projects, et cetera. And this green revolution that's been talked about by the Biden administration is moving forward with that, influx of money. But the last time that we saw money go into green projects, we had projects like Solyndra that ended up being a drain on the American people. You're sitting in Congress right now. Obviously, you have a voice and a role to play. How do you make sure that money is spent judiciously and doesn't turn into just a bunch of Solyndras?
Well, I think it's, making sure that the companies we're doing business with are transparent, but also doing the due diligence and the fact checking on the government side, and making sure we don't have multiple or even one Solyndra issue. And you see that not just with energy, but you see that with disasters. I mean, you see it everywhere. It's unfortunately much more common than it should be. And I think it really is just a matter of making sure that we are fact checking and doing the due diligence on the federal side to make sure that we don't have bad actors really stealing from the government.
And certainly we do see it all across, all across government, right? The money is not always spent the way it's supposed to. Which brings me to like the infrastructure bill itself. Lots of money, lots of opportunity for Alaska. Has your office had a chance in the last couple of weeks to really sit down with the rest of the delegation and start talking about how to make sure that that money gets allocated and directed as much as it can? Because obviously we're a resource, and we're a high energy cost resource and transmission poor state.
Well, unfortunately, we did have the disaster, the Merbach disaster, and
Right.
and other things that came up. And so we haven't had a chance to sit down in a really organized way and collaborate the way it would imagine that it would go.
It's been 3 weeks, Mary. You've been busy. I get
Yeah.
it.
Thank you for having realistic expectations, being
Sure.
plunked in the last basically 9 days of session, 9 business days, and just really thrown in the deep end. And I think it would have been a bit different if this disaster hadn't struck. And
Right.
that really, I think, appropriately diverted a lot of our attention as necessary. But no, it's something that we will, I'm sure, be doing. And I do want to give kudos to both of our senators from Alaska. They're both very high achievers. They are both very committed to Alaska and Alaskans, and they've both been very collegial and welcoming, and it's been a good experience. But all of that said, no, we just don't have the time that we really need to sit down and coordinate and pick apart huge packages like this. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Certainly. So let's change subject just a little bit. Let's talk about accessing Alaska's resource wealth, right? I just made the comment that we're a big state without a whole ton of infrastructure. So what should be the path forward for accessing those opportunities to drive jobs and to bring about, mining opportunities, gas opportunities, whatever have you? Obviously, there are groups out there that don't want anything built. They want Alaska to be pristine. I think that there's a balance between stewardship and development. I know you believe that there's ways forward. So how do you work in Congress to get roads and rail and whatever to resource opportunity and job opportunities?
Well, you really hit the nail on the head, Rick. It is a balance, and it is a bit of a maze. And we do have folks who are just very committed on both sides. I really, the problem in Alaska isn't a lack of resources. The issue is the economics, and
Right.
also making sure that we're always acknowledging the importance of the relationship that we have with our communities and treating them with respect and valuing each community's different lifestyles and traditions.
Right.
Alaska is so far away from almost every single market, even if you're looking within Alaska at where the resources come from and then where the markets are for those resources. And so often we're lacking roads from the resources to Tidewater for shipment. There's such high cost in the capital part of it and operating costs in Alaska. And that all means that we need bigger deposits that are attracting more private dollars and justifying private investment to take on that level of risk. I mean, most of the projects in Alaska, you're talking multiple billions of dollars. I think the Donlin project was like $5 or $6 billion. And when you're talking to investors, a lot of investors wonder what the threshold is for too many billions for it not to pencil out. But we really need developers to be conscientious of the nearby communities and working with the people to find the best alternatives to access and developing the resources, and just making sure we're working with people in local communities. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that we're facing.
You just made the comment about getting, looking at the economies of this, and you're right, Congresswoman. You have a lot of large scale opportunities that are miles away. Washington, D.C. doesn't always remember that, right? I mean, they look at D.C. to Boston as being a big trip. We talk about Anchorage to Fairbanks, and everybody goes, "Oh, that's 350 miles. That's a long ways." It's really not in the context of the state. But when you talk about whether it's a deep water port in Nome, whether it's the Ambler Road, whether it's the power, the natural gas line out to Donlin, you're talking about economies of scale and dollar figures that are incredible. How does your role in Congress relate to helping private investors realize federal dollars be spent wisely? How does that all work? And we have about a minute and a half for your answer.
Well, I think that part of it is just telling the story, and we have such a fascinating story. I mean, it's very commonplace for you and me being Alaskan, but what I'm realizing is people just kind of, number one, they don't understand the scope of Alaska, and once you tell them a little bit, they just want to know more. They're very fascinated with Alaska. Absolutely. I mean, coming from living in Bethel the last 14 years year round, it is a 400-mile plane trip to the nearest Costco. It is a 400-mile plane trip to the nearest Fred Meyer or Cars. Right. So, part of it is just the narrative, but, and honestly, I don't know what else to say except to be there. Sure. And make sure that you have an audience that is receptive, that you're not engaged in some kind of argument with, or bickering with, or a small scale war with. So much of it is making sure that you have good relationships so they'll at least listen to your side with open ears. And people aren't going to listen if they already don't like you, or if you show up in a combative stance. So much of it is just working on positive relationships, and then doing everything in our power as Alaskans to make sure they understand what our situation actually is.
Sounds good. Congresswoman Mary Peltola, my guest here on Congressional Conversations. We're going to take a short break, come back, and we're going to talk about oil and gas and mining as we continue on with the Power of the Future sponsored Congressional Conversation with Congresswoman for all Alaska, Mary Peltola. We're back with Congressional Conversations brought to you by Power of the Future. My guest today, Congresswoman for all Alaska, Mary Peltola. That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I'm not complaining. Yeah.
I bet you aren't. It's probably the honor of a lifetime, and something that I know that Alaska and Alaskans, regardless of party affiliation and regardless of where they are from in the state, are very, very proud of you. So
it really is the honor of a lifetime, Rick. And I'm just very happy to be where I am and doing what I'm doing.
Good. So let's talk oil and gas and mining throughout the rest of the time together. ONG, oil and gas development, from Prudhoe Bay on, has really been the lifeblood of so much of what drives Alaska. 1 out of 4 jobs are directly or indirectly tied on the private side, private sector, to oil and gas development. All of our state and all of our state employees really get their jobs paid for by oil and gas and ultimately permanent fund, which comes from oil and gas. So what's your stance, Mary, on continued development, and how do you and Congress plan to work to help, even though there's a talk about a just transition away from fossil fuels, how do you work with, with Alaskans to make sure that those changes don't cost people jobs and lifestyle?
Well, and of course, philosophically, I'm completely on board with the transition idea. The Sure. trick is the details, and like you say, making sure we're not losing jobs, making sure that Alaska is still able to pay its bills. I do support continued North Slope exploration and development, specifically the ConocoPhillips Willow project and Santos Pica project. Sure. As long as our explorers and producers with the state and federal government are willing to work with local communities and people, I believe we can accomplish a lot. Not everything that everyone on both sides wants, but enough to look back and consider it a success. Building consensus doesn't mean that there aren't compromises on both sides, but I think that our permitting process is robust. I think that it is healthy. I think that the alternative processes are that is a good way to do things. And if you look at what ends up going into permitting or gets permitted, a lot of times it's alternative E or F, or, you know, pretty on down the alphabet. So these are compromises to build consensus. Regarding Cook Inlet, additional natural gas is critical and important for rail belt communities that depend on that fuel for heat and power generation. And I do support exploration to ensure that the needs of the rail belt are met.
Okay, so you mentioned permitting, NEPA reform, whether it's the Joe Manchin plan, whether it's what Senator Sullivan has come out and talked about. Should there be NEPA reform? Should there be timelines and litigation limits and things like that? Is that part of the robust public process that still needs to be met?
Well, and I'm not a huge critic of the NEPA process. I think that it is a good process. And one of the things that I think is a shortcoming is the way that we provide resources to that process. I think that most of our agencies are chronically understaffed. We chronically see a revolving door of people at all levels of those agencies transitioning in and out. The 6 years I worked for the Donlin Gold Project, I think we had 3 different people from Army Corps of Engineers as the point person for that project. And it's very challenging to start over brand new with every new lead. And then that goes right on down their food chain. So I think that we need to do a much better job resourcing our agencies and making sure that those positions are positions that people want to stay in, because you're just starting at zero again every time you get a new person. So those are some of the flaws that I see within the process, but I do have faith in our permitting process.
Okay.
In large part.
I appreciate that background too, especially with you having, spent the time at Donlin and seen the Army Corps churn. That's you're right, as part of the process that kind of starts and stops throughout the permitting timeline. So
and they're hardly ever Alaskans. They're mostly from the lower 48, and you just really have to start at ground zero with, explaining who the stakeholders are, explaining some of the handicaps, I guess, or, deficiencies that a lot of, like, talking about soft skills. People just don't understand what goes into workforce development if you're not from Alaska. So yeah, I think we need to get more Alaskans in these agency positions and more continuity and just less turnover.
Okay. LNG has become almost a geopolitical capital tool, as well as a pressure point for Europe and for parts even of America, right? New England is talking about rolling blackouts and brownouts. So Alaska LNG, trillions, hundreds of trillions of cubic feet stranded up on the slope. How can you and Congress work to get that to market, incentivize it? I know that the AK LNG project got some federal guarantees in the Infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act and in the infrastructure bill itself last year. So how does Congresswoman Peltola help drive Alaskan LNG to market across the world?
Well, this is an area that I am probably in need of learning a lot more about, because rural Alaska, we have such a dependence on stove oil for our heating needs and other things. But like I said, I am open and receptive to working with everyone and anyone on tackling this issue, but I don't have, specific talking points on that at this moment.
And again, I mean, it's a question that you're going to get asked by lots of people over the next time, whatever your time in Congress is, right? Because it is trillions, hundreds of trillions of trillions of cubic feet of gas. And so just, I get asked that all the time. How do we get it to market? figured it was a fair question, but
Well,
I agree with you.
and this has been the decades-long problem for
Right.
Alaskans. When I served in the legislature, there were old vintage newspapers framed on the wall about getting LNG to market,
Right.
you know, from decades and decades and decades before. And we have different ideas about, you know, getting LNG on tankers from up north and shipping it over the top to Europe, to try to alleviate some of the dependence that Europe has on Russian products. There's been a lot of different ideas, and I think that if this were an easy question, it would have been solved a long time ago. I think
I agree.
there's so much in terms of, you know, looking at which project pencils out. The effort that was done most recently by Governor Walker was a yeoman's effort, and all of the producers had their sleeves rolled up and were completely, you know, I don't want to say invested like in terms of money, but there was a huge investment, but then also just emotionally, mentally invested in tackling this. And it just seems to be one of those things that we are just struggling to get there on. And it's not for lack of will. It's not for lack of trying. It's not for lack of everyone's joint efforts. It's just a hard nut to crack. But I certainly, project. Yeah, and I certainly want to be a good person to work with on this. And I don't want in any way to be an obstructionist or, you know, but I don't have a silver bullet. I'm not going to pretend that I'm here to save the day. And, you know, so I'll leave it at that.
One last question before I get to the last, you know, time where you get to talk about your campaign and how people can get a hold of you. Alaska is rich in mineral resources, strategic supply chains, trying to end dominance and dependence on China for critical and strategic minerals as part of this green revolution. How can Congresswoman Peltola help drive American domestic supply chains coming from Alaska, whether it's project related, manufacturing related, or all of the above?
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry,
Sure,
Rick.
absolutely. Getting domestic supply chains of critical and strategic minerals when Alaska has so many of them, whether it's Ambler, whether it's Eucor and Bocan Mountain, you know, whether it's Pebble, whether it's other opportunities out in rural Alaska that mean jobs and opportunities. If we're going to have a domestic supply chain of critical strategic minerals, especially those needed for green technology, how does Congress and how does Congresswoman Peltola help drive that discussion and make Alaska kind of the tip of the spear?
Well, again, I think it has a lot to do with our narrative and showing and reiterating and showing examples of how we do resource development responsibly, how we do it right, how we have a commitment to local hire and including local communities in having acceptable projects. I think that it's really important that we compare our process to the processes in third world countries in jurisdictions that are not safe and stable, and just making sure that they know the Alaskan story and that we are here and ready and willing to be one of the solutions for our own nation's energy security, and making sure that long-term we are lowering our footprint in terms of carbon emissions, and that we intend to do everything by the book and by the highest possible standards and using the best science, and also the best kind of corporate social responsibility and environmental justice and social justice, and incorporating all those things as we move forward. And we can't just put our efforts on a shelf and go completely with third world jurisdictions where they don't have a concern for those issues.
Right. Okay, we are almost out of time on this conversation, but for Alaskans who are watching this, or anyone that wants to get more involved and find out more about you and interact with you, how do they do that in the last few weeks of the campaign?
Well, marypeltola.com is my campaign website, and you can reach out to us through that website. We also are doing a lot to get out to communities and meeting with people face to face. But really the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, marypeltola.com. And I'm really looking forward to the month ahead and getting out and talking to more Alaskans face to face, person to person, and having that interaction. And I really appreciate the opportunity that you've given me here today, Rick. I really appreciate the dialogue.
It's been a great time, Mary. Thank you again for taking it. I know your schedule is packed. So we will finish off with a big thank you, and we'll catch up down the line. This has been the Congressional Conversation with the Congresswoman for All Alaska, Mary Peltola, brought to you by Power of the Future. Have an energy-filled week, everyone.